everybody. So a couple days ago I made a video about the houses in the natal chart using the star cards, and I'd eventually like to do videos a little bit more in depth about each of the houses, but the one that I wanted to start with is actually the 8th house because I found myself when I was making the video, the part 2 of the houses using the star cards, the 8th house, this one, was the one that I found that I wanted to go on and on with more than I kind of felt like I had the time to do. So going off of the card here, right, the 8th house is, and you'll see things like shared resources, sex, taboo, the occult, and all of these other things, right, that are 8th house in nature. The 8th house is it's one of those houses that seems to encompass so much that it tends to be hard to understand. I want to make it clear again, I do think it has to do with death, but it's more transformational and metamorphosis sort of death and rebirth than actual death, like going 6 feet under. So that's a big one. Sex, I kind of already went into that in the other video. The sort of, soulful, deep soul merging sort of sex that you have with somebody else that transforms you, that changes you. And also outside of sex, just those kinds of close relationships that transform you in some way because of the other person. That's also very much like 8th house territory. And I do think that's why sex gets lumped in here quite a bit, or one of the reasons why. Another thing that the 8th house has a lot to do with is inheritance. Now, this can be actual inheritance, like money or resources that you inherit from somebody after they pass on, or that you just inherit from somebody while they're still alive. People do that all the time. They give family members things while they're still alive, things of an important nature. Those sorts of inheritances would fall here. But me and Natalie have talked about this before. The idea of generational inheritance being an 8th house thing. Now, this could also be a 4th house thing. Your genetics, that stems from your roots, that stems from 4th house stuff. But I do feel like there's something to be said about generational inheritances in terms of it could be in terms of physical things that we inherit from our family members. It absolutely could be. But I'm also thinking, how you hear people talk about generational curses. I don't really know if I believe in curses in the sense of the way I think people sometimes say that. But okay, like I can think of some families that I know of that have a whole host of fucked up shit that goes on in that family, and it's generational. There's the grandparent that was fucked. There's the parent that was fucked. Their child's fucked. That sounds really negative, but generational issues, let me put it a little nicer, generational issues that spring up in families. I think those kind of things can be seen by the 8th house. The things that we want to perhaps change about our inheritance, what we've inherited from our families, the things that we want to transform beyond, that would be an 8th house thing. Yeah. So I don't know how much that's actually usually thought about in terms of inheritance, but her and I both have talked about this, and that it's an important part of this house. So if you ever get a reading from one of us, you might hear us talking about the 8th house in that way in your chart if it makes sense to. Sometimes that doesn't fit. But I found that a lot of the time it does. A lot of the time it does in some form or fashion. Of course, how that fits would depend on, you know, all kinds of things, like where the 8th house ruler falls in the chart, and different aspects that it makes, and what planets fall in the 8th house, if any, you know, all of that kind of stuff would need to be taken into consideration. Another thing that her and I have joked about, well, and it's not really a joke because actually it kind of makes sense here in a way. If we're talking about things like generational inheritance, we've joked, and this might sound kind of crass, we've joked about the 8th house as being like, okay, it deals with sex, right? It's one of the houses that deals with sex, the deep soul merging between two people, that kind of sex. Oftentimes that kind of sex produces children in those kind of relationships. So we kind of have joked about this house is like being the cunt. So it's kind of, that's probably really crass, whatever. But perhaps there's something to that too. I mean, all of the water houses, the 8th, the 12th, and the 4th, or the houses that have water affinity, it's almost like, okay, you could think of the 8th house as conception. You could think of the 12th house, and this is how people sometimes think of the 12th house, the period of time between conception and birth. And then there's some people that feel like the 4th house represents birth. So I could, but I haven't ever seen, her or I haven't really ever seen the 8th house included in this. It's usually just the 12th and the 4th in this way. So, sorry, my incense is like going crazy. So, let me move it. So, adding that one in there as like the conception part of all of that does kind of make sense. And I don't know, I guess maybe we decided to give it, to think of it in such a crass way because, well, I don't know, the 8th house is kind of taboo. So it just kind of made sense. But yeah, so I just kind of wanted to do this quickly and mention some other thoughts that we've had about the 8th. But yeah, it's definitely all the things that I mentioned before. But I wouldn't, when you're looking at the 8th, I would not rule out the idea of possible generational inheritance. That kind of, and because the 8th house is kind of like the bridge between the conscious and the unconscious, right? Again, with the 4, 8, 12 house, you know, those houses, 4th house being the deeply conscious mind, the deeply conscious part of you, and the 12th house being the unconscious part of you. The 8th house kind of serves as a bridge between the two. So some of that generational inheritance, if there is any there, might end up kind of stuck on that bridge. Really anything in the 8th house tends to, I have found, tends to kind of be stuck on that bridge a little bit, and it needs to be pulled off that bridge to become more conscious. And again, that's found by doing different things, by looking at different things in your chart, like where the ruler of the 8th house falls, what sign it's in, what the fuck it's doing, all kinds of stuff. But yeah, I figured this, I wanted to add a little bit more about the 8th. So I might end up doing this with other ones too, probably. But yeah, I guess I will see you all later.